God picks differently than you and I pick. We pick based on all the ascertainable information that we get from whatever source we get, but God picks based on inside information a lot of times that you and I know nothing about. God says you're destined to win.
We gotta turn it around.
Welcome to Destined to Win, everybody. I want to begin by acknowledging that we've just come through a rough time of transition for our nation, the presidential election. By now, we know exactly who won the presidency, and more than likely half the country is still in an uproar. Well, let me assure you of this. God's not upset. He's not taken off guard. He's not surprised. He was prepared for the next president. In fact, many people would say he picked the president. Whether you agree with that theory or not, this I know. God picks differently than we pick. Man looks at the outward appearance, but God has a much bigger perspective. And this principle transcends election cycles and political offices, because here's the key. Once you understand how God sees and selects someone, you begin to understand that you have been selected by God as well. Yeah, you've been picked by God to do great things despite what you may think. You see, God's not looking for the perfect candidate. He's not waiting on you to be perfect. He just needs you to be willing. If you'll get to that point, God will propel you to be something powerful. You may never make it to be president, but maybe you'll be a great mom or an influential marketplace leader or a strong pillar in the local church. So I want this program to lift your spirits. Maybe your presidential candidate didn't win, but hey, the good news is God has chosen you for greatness. Stay tuned and let's get into today's message.
When I read this particular text, to me, there isn't a more time-appropriate text than this. For the Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks at the outward, but God looks at the inward. And said another way, very simply, God picks differently than we pick. Man picks, we pick based on ascertainable information. We pick based on media-given information. We pick based on observation. We pick based on personal motivation. We pick based on cultural sensation. We pick based on biased recommendation. But God picks based on inside information. God picks differently than we pick. Matter of fact, enter David. If there's anybody who ever should not have been picked to be king, it should have been David. Everything about David said, don't pick me. Even the place that David grew up in. David grew up in the little town of Bethlehem. David's father was a farmer. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a statesman. He wasn't influential. He was a farmer. He had 8 boys, 7 other brothers. The village that they lived in consumed their worldview. Bethlehem was a little tiny dot on the map. They never thought beyond the realm of Bethlehem. Everything they knew about life and how people did life and how people interacted in life revolved around Bethlehem. And he wasn't dreaming about king someday. The geographic location that David grew up in screamed and shouted out to him, you aren't the right pick. But not only that, his position in the family said you're not the right pick. David wasn't first. He wasn't the firstborn. He wasn't the secondborn. He wasn't the thirdborn. He was the 8th born. If Jesse was coming over the house to pick the next king, it certainly wasn't going to be David. David had no shot at becoming king of Israel. If anybody was going to get that honor, it was going to be the oldest, Eliab. And so when Samuel comes, and Eliab is before him, and Samuel thinks in his heart, surely this is the Lord's anointed. But God said, that ain't him. And so he looks at the next boy, and that ain't him, and the next boy, and that ain't him. And he goes through the 7 boys, and none of them are him. And so he's thinking, well, do you have anybody else? And what I love about this is his position in the family says there's no way that you can be the pick. But at the same time, David is God's pick. All of the pundits in David's life, Every life is full of pundits. Did you know that? Not just in the political environment, but every life that is lived has pundits in it. People who are saying things and sharing things and pointing out things and thinks that their opinions are the right opinions and so on and so forth. And David's life was full of pundits that declared and said unto him that he wasn't the right pick. And the first pundit that David had to deal with was his father. His father didn't think he was the right pick, and so when you look at Samuel's conversation with Jesse, Samuel says to Jesse, he says, listen, he said, do you have any more sons? And do you know what Jesse says to Samuel? Listen to this. This is amazing. Message translation, verse 11, 1 Samuel chapter 16. Well, there's the runt, but he's out tending sheep. Samuel, he's not the right pick. He's the runt. And could you imagine David, the night before that Samuel was coming to the house to anoint the next king, and David's all excited because, the family, hey, Samuel's coming in, and he's going to pick one of you boys to be the next king. So all the boys are all excited, and they probably had David next to their room because he was the youngest, and, as the youngest, he probably got away with the most, so he's sneaking out of bed at night and listening in his parents' room and stuff like that, and he's listening as his parents are extolling the praises of why each son should be the next king. And I think Eliab should be the next king because Eliab is so smart, and Eliab is so handsome, and he's got his act together, and he holds himself in a stately manner. And then they go on to the next one, and they talk about how Abinadab should be the next king, and he should be the next king because he always has a heart for people and a compassion for people, and he's got a good look as well. And then they go to the next one, and Shammah should be king, and this one should be king. And David is kind of waiting with bated breath as they are going down the line. He's thinking, I can't wait to hear what they're going to say about me. Why do they think that I should be king? And David's listening in, and you know what he hears when it comes to his name? The click of the lantern. They don't even bring him up. And the reason why they don't bring him up is because David's father doesn't think that he is the right pick. But David's second pundit in his life is his brother, because his father says, go down to the battlefield to check on your brothers and come back with a report. And so David goes down there. He's got his 12-pack of Monster with him, his big family-sized pack of Cool Ranch Dorito chips, and he's going down on the battlefield to check it out and talking to them about it. And he hears Goliath, and Goliath is challenging the people of Israel. And David says this, I'll go down and fight him. And listen to what his brother says. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 28. I'm reading from the Message. It says, what are you doing here? Why aren't you minding your own business, tending the scrawny flock of sheep? I know what you're up to. You came down here to see the sights, hoping for a ringside seat to a bloody battle. And so then David gets brought before King Saul because nobody would volunteer to go out and fight Goliath. And so David says, I'll do it. And word gets back to King Saul, and King Saul says, bring the guy in. Now, could you imagine what King Saul is thinking in his mind? That this guy who's going to go out and fight Goliath looks like. He's thinking Planet Fitness guy, right? He's thinking, I pick things up and put them down. He's thinking some big, giant, huge guy. And in walks David with skinny jeans, flip-flops, and a T-shirt on, and he's like, oh, man, you ain't the right pick. You ain't the right pick because you don't have the right look. You don't have the look to be king. But then not only that, listen to what he says. Not only didn't he have the look, Saul answered David, verse 33, you can't go out and fight this Philistine. You're too young and inexperienced. And he's been in this fighting business since before he was born. Not only don't you have the right look, but you don't have the right experience. Look at the pundits. The pundits are just throwing it out there. I mean, this is everybody. I mean, you couldn't find anybody in Israel that would have said, I know who should be our next king. Our next king ought to be that 12-year-old boy named David. Let's pick him because his experience is he watches over his father's sheep. And so he would be a good candidate, even though he's never been a man of war, even though he's never fought. He would be wonderful. You couldn't find anybody. And then what I particularly like is when David gets out on the battlefield, not only does his father, the first pundit, say you're the wrong pick, not only does brother, the second pundit, say you're the wrong pick, not only does number 3, his king, the third pundit, say he's the wrong pick, but he walks out there and his opponent Goliath, his biggest pundit, says this to him, am I a dog that you come to me with a stick? Come on, man, you cannot be the right pick for this thing. But here's what I want you to understand, that he was God's pick, because God picks differently than you and I pick. We pick based on all the ascertainable information that we get from whatever source we get, but God picks based on inside information a lot of times that you and I know nothing about. Now, here's what God told me to share with some of you, because some of you on a personal level don't feel like the right pick. You know, we battle with our own insecurities and things like that. And God wanted me to remind just a few of you that you're God's pick. You're God's choice. John 15, verse 16, you didn't choose me, but I chose you. And I appointed you that you should go forth and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain. And whatever you ask the Father in my name, he'll give it to you. You're God's pick. You're God's choice. 1 Peter 2:9. You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you should show forth the praises of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Jeremiah 1:5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I sanctified you and ordained you a prophet to the nations. You know what that means? It means before any of us were a twinkle in our Father's eye, God chose us. Before any of us were a thought in our mama's mind, God chose us. Before our hands were webbed in the womb, God chose us. Before our mother threw up in her first trimester of pregnancy, God chose us. Before they knew our gender, God chose us. Listen to me, church. Life does not begin at conception. It begins way before that, in the mind and heart of God, who has a purpose for every person that he places on the planet. But I want you to notice something. He didn't just say, I picked you, I chose you. And by the way, notice how God picks. God picked even before there was a good and bad done. Before you were in the womb, I chose you. I consecrated you. I'm just really feeling somebody who needs to hear this. Somebody who's purposeless right now. Somebody who doesn't understand their why. Somebody who doesn't see the value in their life. Before you were in the womb, I consecrated you. That doesn't mean just ordained you to live holy. Thank God for holiness. Last message that I preached a couple of weeks ago was about holiness. I believe in holiness. But that's not what God means when it says, I consecrated you. What it means is I set you apart for a specific purpose. Even before you arrived in the birth canal, I predetermined the purpose for which you would walk on the planet. And the great thing about understanding that God has given you a purpose is, if God has given you a purpose, the only one that can stop your purpose is you. There are no pundits that can stop your purpose. There are no politics that can stop your purpose. There is no situation, because the purpose rests not with your president, but with your king. Your purpose lies in the hands of your God and your king. He is the one in whom we find our hope and in whom we find our trust. And the reason why God picks differently than man picks is because God, number two, sees differently than man sees. Did you notice the text? The text said, do not look at his appearance or his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the hearts. Famous story about a famous artist. In 1463, the city of Florence, Italy, commissioned a then unknown artist in order to give them this great statue for their magnificent church. And they bought this huge block of marble, this 20-foot square block of marble, and they presented it to the artist. And on the transport of the marble dropped, and it was fractured, it was cracked. And the artist who was originally selected looked at this cracked piece of marble, and he said, I need another piece. I can't do anything with this cracked piece of marble. How many of you understand that God can do some stuff with some cracked pieces of marble? And you ought to be grateful that God can do some stuff with some cracked pieces of marble, because as valuable as every one of us is, I want you to know that each one of us is a cracked piece of marble, and but for the grace of God, we would be considered useless. The artist said, I can't do nothing with this, and he quit the job. And so the marble that was valuable sat useless for 13 years. Just sat there. Valuable but unused, because it had a crack. And it didn't have a little crack. It had a big crack. It was fractured. It was so bad that we can't do anything with this. And then they got another guy, and they said, hey, why don't you take a look at the job? And the guy looked at the job, and he was excited because, it could be his claim to fame. And he looked at the job. He said, it's an impossible task. And for 38 more years, that valuable piece of marble that was cracked lay useless, until a then unknown but yet master artist stepped forward. And this master artist was amazing, but weird, peculiar. People couldn't figure him out. And the reason why he was weird and peculiar is because before he would sculpt anything, he would walk for days around whatever he was sculpting, just staring and looking and, probably just grabbing his artist beard. He probably had one of them artist beards like this, or twirling his mustache and just looking and looking and looking. And people would, I don't understand, what is up with this guy? Why is this guy just staring at this thing and staring at this thing? When is he going to do some work? Thank God the artist's name was Michelangelo. And after walking around it for a week, finally for 3 years began to chisel and to sculpt. And from that fractured piece of marble, he created one of the world's greatest pieces of art, the David. David, the cracked piece of marble that God selected, I think was sovereignly sculpted from a cracked piece of stone for the world to see as a remembrance that Israel's greatest king came from a cracked piece of marble. Somebody who had issues and fractured and things that other people would say you can't use this individual and you got to overlook this individual. But I'm glad that God overlooks our faults and our failures and our mistakes. It doesn't mean that he doesn't notice, but he sees beyond them to the potential and to the king that is on the inside of every single one of us. And we ought to be grateful as children of God that that's how God sees. God wants us to be people of integrity. But here's what God does. He takes people who are on their way to kill Christians. Saul of Tarsus, who are on their way to commit atrocities that would disqualify him in the minds of so many different people from being what he ultimately became. And God gives him an experience and says, he's a chosen vessel unto me. And he goes from a murderer to an apostle. He goes from somebody who hated Christians to somebody who gave his life for Christians. He goes from somebody that never cared a lick about Christianity to somebody who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. Why? Because God picks differently than we pick. And the reason why God picks differently is because God sees differently than we see. My Bible says, Romans chapter 5, verse number 8. It says, but God demonstrated his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. There is not a person here, there is not a person on the planet who has not been called out of darkness into this marvelous light, who God hasn't tapped on the shoulder in the middle of your mess and in the middle of your situation. That's what makes the gospel different. That's what makes our God different, because our God can see past the fractures and he can see past the warts and he can see past the mistakes, because before he formed you, he knew you and he had a design for you, and his eye is on the design even past the mistakes. And it's not just David, and it's not just me, and it's not just Bishop Hines, but it's Everybody in the Bible. Noah got drunk and God picked him. Jacob was a cheater and God picked him. Paul was a murderer and God picked him. Abraham was a moon worshiper and God picked him. Jonah ran from God and God picked him. Gideon was a coward hiding behind a wine press and God picked him. Miriam was a gossiper and God picked her. Martha was a warrior and God picked her. Mary was a teenager, God picked her. Esther was an orphan slave girl and God picked her. Thomas was a doubter and God picked her. Sarah was impatient and God picked her. Elijah was moody and God picked him. Moses stuttered and God picked him. Joseph bragged a lot and God picked him. Peter was always saying the wrong thing at the wrong time and God picked him. Zacchaeus was a crook and God picked him. God picks people that we would never, ever dream about picking. This is powerful in presidential revelation. Christians are puzzled about this pick. The church can't agree on the pick. We've had prominent ministers stand up and put their support behind X. Prominent ministers stand up and put their support against Y and speak out and speak for. But you can't see God going, whoa, look at that, man. Look at that good quality right there. And look at that good quality right there. Whoa, I put that right there on the inside. And I know this mess has gotten in the way, but I see something behind all that mess right there. I know this crack, this fracture right here is impeding people from seeing the gift that is on the inside right here. But I'm looking and I see and I know that there is something because before they were in the womb, I consecrated them and I set them apart and I had a plan for their purpose. And I want to urge the church to come to a place where we look at them through the prism of how God has picked us.
Let's face it, it can be hard to understand how God chooses those he places in authority. He sees the heart while we see only the outer appearance. But understanding that God is able to use even flawed people to lead the nation reveals how much more he's ready to use you and me for his kingdom purposes. The most puzzling pick of all isn't who God selects as president, but it's that he has chosen us with our messed up selves, with our issues, with our character flaws. He's chosen us to be his influence within the nations. That's why it is so important for us to be able to maintain a healthy, biblical perspective of the political arena. God's not limited to choosing between red and blue, Republicans or Democrats. God works through people and governments to achieve his will. So as believers, we cannot allow the divisiveness and bitterness of politics to hijack his kingdom purposes. God is much bigger than what happens at the ballot box. That's why I just released my newest series. It's called Politicked. I felt that someone needed to stand up and declare that God is not limited to our system of promotion or election. It's so vitally important now that the election is over that we discover what our real role as believers is in the world. We are called to cover those in authority with prayer, and yes, even the ones we disagree with. In this series, I share ways that God wants to use you to expand his influence. Everyone that listens to this series is getting their perspective rocked, and I want to share it with you as well. Call or go online today with your financial support to this ministry. And as a way of saying thank you, I'll send you a copy. Your support goes a long way to help us get the gospel out to the world through this program and our outreach ministries. As part of this special broadcast offer, when you call today, I'll also send you my book, Identity Crisis. If you've ever struggled with questions like, who am I? Why am I here? This book will help you discover your God-given purpose. Learn how to shake off the grasshopper mentality and begin to think like a more than conqueror. Once you get this book, you'll be able to see the you that God sees within you and no longer be pulled or swayed by the judgments of other people. My announcer is coming in just a minute to tell you how you can get your copy of today's exclusive broadcast offer. I'll be right back. Watch this.
For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. 1 Samuel 16:7.
Pastor Frank Santora has taken this popular scripture and blown the doors off with the relevant and provocative sermon you heard today, God's Pick for President. In his one-of-a-kind New York style, Pastor Frank pierces the veil on the recent election and provides the biblical perspective on where we truly are as a nation. He declares boldly that heaven is not limited by what the polls, politicians, or pundits say. God is in control, and Pastor Frank reveals just how God can work through the most unlikely person to build his kingdom. Now that the election is over, this message is what we need as believers to chart the course of revival in America. You can get this insightful message exclusively in response to today's program for your gift of any amount, plus shipping and handling. This message is not only for today, but it is historic as it speaks to one of the most important elections in American history. Call now with your gift of any amount to get this message right now. And for those of you who are ready to become the force that God wants you to be, there is more to this special offer that you must hear. For your gift to the ministry of just $40, you can get Pastor Frank's entire Politics series, which includes the message you saw today, plus other powerful sermons that deal with the most pressing issues affecting our world. For example, in the message, The ABCs of Racial Healing, Pastor Frank spells out God's solution to race relations.
And Jesus is like, no, you don't understand, I'm going. But I'm not going with the same kind of race message as everybody else is going to. I'm going with a race message that is going to meet a grace message. And when grace meets race, guess what? Race loses every single time.
This series is a must-have. It's not only good for your personal study and development, but it's also a great resource for small group study or for entire ministry teams to go through together. This series is not just lip service. It provides meat-on-the-bones biblical answers to the challenges we face today. In addition to the Politics series, you'll also receive Pastor Frank's best-selling book, Identity Crisis. This inspiring read will help anyone struggling with their purpose to discover why God made you and what He wants from you. You won't be able to put this book down as it fills you with godly confidence. So that's the sermon you heard today, God's Pick for President, for your gift of any amount plus shipping and handling. Or you can get Pastor Frank's entire Politics series, which includes this message, and his book, Identity Crisis, for your gift of $40. Any seeds sown to this ministry go straight to reaching millions with the message that with Jesus, they are destined to win. Don't wait. Call now.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Make sure you take advantage of today's broadcast offer. Real lasting change only comes from knowing and experiencing the goodness of God. Grace and mercy are available to you today. Don't miss next week's broadcast. I can't wait to see you then. And remember, as always, with Jesus, you are destined to win.
If you're in the New York City or Connecticut area, we invite you to visit us at one of our locations or join us online every Sunday on behalf of Pastor Frank and from all of us at Faith Church. God bless you, we love you, and we'll see you next week.